Specialist Mara Kessler stepped off the resupply truck at Forward Operating Base Ardent, carrying one duffel bag and a rifle case she wouldn't let anyone else touch. She was 26, maybe 27, though nobody asked and she didn't offer. Dust from the convoy still hung in the air, catching the late afternoon light, and she stood there for a moment, scanning the perimeter the way someone might glance at a room out of habit rather than necessity. Staff Sergeant Dale Whitlock noticed her first. He was leaning against a Humvee with two other snipers from the section, Corporal Reyes and Specialist Tran, all three of them sharing a bag of sunflower seeds and watching the new arrivals get sorted by the logistics NCO. "That her?" Reyes asked, nodding toward the woman with the rifle case. Whitlock checked the clipboard the logistics NCO had handed him. Kessler, M transferred in from Bagram admin support, apparently. He said it the way a person might mention the weather. Flat. Unimpressed. Admin support. Tran repeated, and laughed once, short and quiet. "We're getting an admin clerk for the sniper section. Orders say she qualified expert on the range course last cycle," Whitlock said, still reading. "Guess somebody upstairs needed to fill a slot and grabbed whoever was available." Mara didn't hear the exact words, but she'd heard versions of this conversation enough times in enough places that she didn't need to. She picked up her duffel, slung the rifle case over her shoulder, and walked toward the cluster of tents where the section was billeted, her boots quiet on the gravel. Whitlock straightened up as she approached and stuck out a hand. "Staff Sergeant Whitlock, Section Lead." His grip was firm, performative, the kind of handshake meant to be felt rather than exchanged. "Heard you're coming over from admin." "Logistics, actually," Mara said. "And yes, right, logistics." He glanced at Reyes, who didn't bother hiding his smirk. "Well, welcome to the section. We run a tight program here. Hope you're ready to keep up." "I'll manage," she said, and that was all. No explanation, no attempt to prove herself in the first 30 seconds the way most new transfers did. She just nodded once and kept walking toward the tent line, leaving the three of them standing there with a distinct, mildly irritating sense that they'd been dismissed. "She say 5 words total?" Tran asked. "Maybe 6, Reyes said. "Big personality, this one." That evening, the section gathered in the equipment tent to issue Mara her gear and confirm her rifle setup. Whitlock ran through the standard list: optic, bipod, ammunition allotment, checking boxes on a form without much enthusiasm. When he got to the suppressor selection, Mara spoke up for the first time since the introductions. "I'll need the longer can, not the standard issue," she said. "And if you've got the heavier barrel profile in supply, I'd rather have that than the lightweight." Whitlock paused, pen hovering over the form. "That's not the standard loadout for a 700 series." "I know," Mara said. "It's not about the standard loadout. It's about the harmonics at distance, especially in this heat. The lightweight barrel walks more under sustained fire, and the standard can changes my drop tables enough that I'd rather not relearn them out here." The tent went quiet for a second. It was the kind of detail a person didn't pull out of a manual. It was the kind of detail that came from hours on a rifle, in places where getting the drop wrong meant missing, and missing meant something worse than embarrassment. Reyes raised an eyebrow at Tran. Whitlock recovered first, clearing his throat. "Sounds like somebody read the equipment manual on the flight over." "Something like that," Mara said, and let it go. She didn't argue the point, didn't explain herself further, just held out her hand for the requisition slip and signed where he pointed. After she left with her gear, Whitlock tossed the clipboard onto the supply table. "Manual," he said again, shaking his head. "She quoted barrel harmonics like she's been doing this 20 years. Maybe she just memorizes things well," Reyes offered. "Admin types do that. Forms, regs, whatever. Doesn't mean she can shoot." "We'll find out soon enough," Whitlock said. "Range day's Thursday. We'll see what Bagram's finest can actually do with a rifle." Thursday came with a thin haze over the valley and a light wind that made the long-distance lanes on the range tricky, the kind of wind experienced shooters respected and inexperienced ones underestimated. The section set up at the 700-meter line first, working through standard qualification targets before moving back for the longer shots that actually separated a good shooter from a great one. Mara waited her turn without comment, watching the others shoot, saying nothing about their group sizes even when Tran's first 3 rounds opened up wider than they should have in that wind. When her turn came, she settled behind the rifle with an economy of movement that took less than 10 seconds. No fidgeting with the bipod. No readjusting her cheek weld twice the way nervous shooters often did. She simply got behind the gun and became still. Her first shot landed dead center. So did her second. By her 5th round, Whitlock had stopped pretending to check his own equipment and was watching her through the spotting scope instead, his expression unreadable. "Winds gusting 8, maybe 10 from the left," Reyes muttered, more to himself than anyone. "She's not even holding for it." "She's holding for it," Whitlock said quietly. "She's just not making it obvious." When Mara finished her string and stood, brushing dust off her sleeves, nobody said anything for a moment. Then Tran, perhaps unwilling to let the silence stand, broke it. "Lucky group," he said. "Tight conditions today. Anybody could have shot that." Mara looked at him for a moment, not annoyed, not defensive, just looking, the way someone looks at a comment that isn't worth the energy of correcting. "Sure," she said, and walked back to clean her rifle, leaving the comment to hang there, unanswered and somehow less convincing for it. Whitlock said nothing else that day, but that night, alone in the command tent under a single hanging light, he pulled up her personnel file out of simple curiosity, expecting to find a thin record full of admin postings and basic qualifications. What he found instead was a file with several lines blacked out, 2 deployment slots marked only with unit designations he didn't recognize, and a date range that didn't match anything she'd told them about Bagram at all. He stared at the screen for a long moment, then closed the laptop without writing anything down, telling himself it was probably just a clerical error. But some small, persistent part of him wasn't sure that was true. Word spread through the section faster than Whitlock would have liked, mostly because Reyes couldn't keep his mouth shut after a few beers in the rec tent 2 nights after the range day. "I'm telling you, something's off with her file," he said to a table of soldiers from the mortar platoon, lowering his voice in the way people do when they want everyone to lean in closer. Whitlock pulled it up. Half of it's redacted. Deployment dates that don't line up with what she told us. "Maybe she's just quiet about her work," said one of the mortar guys, unconvinced. "Quiet, sure, but quiet and redacted are 2 different things." Reyes took a pull from his bottle, and she shoots like she's been doing it her whole life. Didn't even flinch in that win Thursday. By the end of the week, half the base seemed to have an opinion about the new sniper nobody could quite figure out. Some soldiers thought she'd washed out of some other unit and gotten quietly reassigned. Others guessed she was someone's relative, pushed through the pipeline as a favor. A few, mostly younger privates who hadn't learned yet to keep their guesses to themselves, floated theories that bordered on absurd. That she was some kind of investigator, that she was there to report on the section, that she'd done something disciplinary back at her last post, and this was a demotion in disguise. Mara heard fragments of all of it. She heard it in the way conversations stopped a half-second too late when she walked into the chow tent, in the sideways glances during formation, in the overly casual way certain soldiers asked her questions designed to fish for information. Where exactly had she served? Who was her last platoon sergeant? Why had Bagram cut her loose? She answered with the same short, flat honesty she gave everyone else, offering nothing more than what was asked, and that restraint only seemed to make people more curious, not less. Whitlock, for his part, decided the best way to handle an uncomfortable mystery was to test it directly. If she was hiding something, sooner or later it would surface under pressure. If she wasn't, then at least the section would stop wasting time speculating. He organized what he called a team competition, paired shooting drills against the clock, switching positions, working through unknown distance targets that required quick math and faster trigger control. He paired Mara with Tran, who had the fastest natural draw in the section and considerable confidence about it. "Let's see how the new transfer holds up under some actual pressure," Whitlock announced to the section, loud enough that several soldiers from other platoons wandered over to watch. Mara said nothing, just took her position at the line when called. What followed was strange, even to Whitlock, who prided himself on reading shooters well. Mara's first run was good, solidly good, fast enough, accurate enough, but noticeably slower than her performance on the range 2 days earlier. She fumbled a position transition that she clearly could have made smoothly. She held a half-second longer than necessary on her final shot, costing her the run against Tran, who whooped and high-fived Reyes when the clock stopped. "There it is," Tran said, grinning. "Guess Thursday really was a lucky day." Mara just nodded, unslinging her rifle and stepping back from the line without comment. If anyone had been watching her closely instead of celebrating Tran's win, they might have noticed that her hands were perfectly steady, that her breathing hadn't changed at all, that there was no flush of embarrassment or frustration in her face. Nothing that would suggest a person who had just genuinely underperformed in front of a crowd. But almost nobody was watching that closely. Almost nobody except Private First Class Dawson, the section's newest and youngest member, who had been assigned to track times on a clipboard near the firing line. He noticed that Mara's first 3 shots, the slow ones, had landed in a group so tight it looked almost deliberate, as though speed, not accuracy, was the only thing she'd sacrificed. He didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what there was to say or whether anyone would listen to a private fresh out of basic anyway. That evening, during a scheduled mortar response drill, a loud, chaotic exercise meant to simulate incoming fire and test how quickly soldiers could move to cover and respond, Dawson found himself stationed near Mara when the simulated rounds began impacting nearby with concussive thumps that rattled equipment and sent most of the section scrambling, adrenaline spiking visibly in raised voices and quick, jerky movements. Mara moved too, efficiently, correctly, exactly per the drill's requirements. But Dawson, glancing over while reaching for his own gear, noticed her hands as she checked her rifle's chamber. They were completely still. No tremor, no rushed fumbling. Just calm, practiced motion. The kind of stillness that took years to build into a person, or else came from somewhere that made the noise and chaos of a drill feel almost quiet by comparison. He didn't mention it to anyone. Not to Whitlock, not to Reyes, not even to the other privates he normally talked to about everything. Something about the moment felt like it wasn't his to share, like he'd glimpsed something private that wasn't meant for the rumor mill already spinning out of control around her. 2 days later, Sergeant First Class Bauer, the section's senior NCO and a 20-year veteran who rarely involved himself in junior soldier drama, found himself digging through old personnel archives for an unrelated administrative task, and stumbled across a cross-reference that made him stop scrolling entirely. Buried in a footnote of Mara Kessler's service record was a commendation reference number, partially redacted, but not completely. The visible fragment matched a numbering format Bauer recognized from his own time near a Joint Special Operations Task Force years earlier, a designation that had no business appearing anywhere near a logistics transfer's paperwork. He sat back in his chair, staring at the screen, and for the first time since she'd arrived, he found himself wondering not whether the rumors about Specialist Kessler were exaggerated, but whether they had actually undersold whatever it was she was hiding. Bauer didn't bring the commendation reference to Whitlock right away. 20 years in the Army had taught him that half answers caused more damage than no answers at all, and a partially redacted line in an old file wasn't proof of anything except that someone, somewhere, had decided Mara Kessler's past wasn't for general reading. So he kept it to himself, filed it away the way he filed away most things that didn't have an immediate use, and went back to the daily grind of running a section that had, without quite realizing it, organized itself around making one quiet woman's life difficult. It came to a head 3 days later, the morning a small group of visiting officers arrived from battalion to observe training ahead of an upcoming security review. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Renata Voss, The battalion commander, a woman with a reputation for saying very little and noticing everything. She walked the FOB with her hands clasped behind her back, watching soldiers go through their routines with an expression that gave away nothing. Whitlock, eager to make a good impression in front of battalion leadership, organized a live fire demonstration for the section, moving target drills, a stress shoot, and a static display of equipment maintenance to show visiting officers that his snipers ran a disciplined program. In the scramble to set everything up, someone needed to handle the unglamorous work, laying out cleaning kits, hauling ammunition crates, carrying spotting scopes and tripods back and forth from the equipment tent. "Kessler, you're on gear today," Whitlock said, not quite meeting her eyes. "Reyes and Tran will run the demonstration. I want our best shooters in front of the colonel." It wasn't said cruelly, not exactly, but the implication sat in the air clearly enough that several soldiers nearby exchanged glances. The section's newest member, the one with the redacted file and the suspiciously steady hands, relegated to carrying gear like a junior private while the rest of the team performed. Mara nodded once, the same flat acceptance she'd given every slight since arriving, and spent the next hour humping crates of ammunition across the gravel, under a climbing sun, while Reyes and Tran ran their drills for the visiting officers, hitting respectable but unremarkable groups at 500 meters. Colonel Voss watched the demonstration with polite attention, occasionally asking a sharp question about equipment maintenance schedules or ammunition accountability that made Whitlock scramble slightly for answers. At one point, while Tran reloaded for a second run, Voss's gaze drifted across the staging area and landed, briefly, on the woman quietly organizing cleaning rods and bore brushes into neat rows nearby. Something in the way Mara handled the equipment caught the colonel's attention. Not the task itself, but the precision of it. The unconscious efficiency of someone who had broken down and reassembled a rifle so many times that the motion had become invisible, automatic, almost meditative. Voss said nothing, but her eyes lingered a half-second longer than they needed to before she turned back to the demonstration. That evening, after the visiting officers had departed and the section was packing up gear in the fading light, word came down that an actual mission had been added to the schedule for the following morning. Not a drill, not an exercise, but a real convoy escort, moving a logistics column through a mountain pass road that had seen sporadic harassment fire in recent weeks. Battalion wanted designated marksmen positioned at key overwatch points along the route. Whitlock gathered the section to assign positions. He ran through names quickly. Reyes on the lead vehicle, Tran covering the rear element, Bauer coordinating from the command truck. When he reached the end of the list without saying Mara's name, PFC Dawson, standing near the back of the group, found himself speaking up before he'd fully decided to. "What about Specialist Kessler?" he asked. Whitlock glanced at his roster, hesitating just long enough that the pause itself said something. "She's new. Convoy escort through that pass isn't the spot to find out what she's actually capable of under real contact. I'd rather keep her on rear security with the supply trucks." "She qualified expert," Dawson said, immediately regretting how it sounded. Too direct. Too much like a private questioning a staff sergeant's call in front of the whole section. "I just mean, she's earned a real position." A few soldiers shifted uncomfortably. Whitlock's expression hardened slightly. "I appreciate the input, Dawson, but I'll make the call on who goes where." He turned back to the roster. "Kessler rides with the supply element. That's final." Mara, standing near the edge of the group, had heard every word. She didn't argue, didn't ask to be reconsidered, didn't so much as change her expression. She simply nodded the way she always did, and walked off toward the equipment tent to begin checking her gear for the next morning, leaving Dawson standing there with a distinct, frustrated feeling that he'd said something true and watched it accomplish nothing at all. Bauer, who had watched the entire exchange from a short distance away, found himself thinking again about the redacted commendation number buried in her file, and about the particular kind of person who requests a quiet posting after something had clearly gone wrong somewhere else. He didn't know what that something was, but standing there in the cooling evening air, Watching her walk away without complaint for the third time in 2 weeks, he found himself hoping, for reasons he couldn't entirely explain, that tomorrow's convoy went smoothly enough that nobody ever had to find out. It didn't. The convoy left FOB Ardent at 05:30. 11 vehicles strung out along a road that wound up through dry hills before dropping into the narrow mountain pass that had become the focus of battalion's concern. Reyes and Tran rode in overwatch positions near the front of the column, scanning the high ground through their scopes as the vehicles climbed. Mara rode in the back of a supply truck near the rear, her rifle case beside her, watching the landscape slide by through a gap in the canvas with the same unreadable calm she carried everywhere. The pass narrowed just before the halfway point. The road squeezed between a rock face on one side and a steep drop on the other, exactly the kind of terrain that made convoy commanders nervous and ambush planners patient. At 06:47, the first shots hit the lead vehicle. The first round struck the lead vehicle's windshield in a spray of cracked glass, and for one disorienting second, nobody in the convoy understood what was happening. Just noise, sudden and wrong, cutting through the engine drone. Then the second burst hit, raking along the side of the second vehicle, and every soldier in the column understood at once. "Contact left, high ground!" The call went up over the radio net, frantic, half swallowed by the sound of vehicles braking hard and doors slamming open. The convoy commander's voice cut through a second later, ordering vehicles to push forward off the X, out of the kill zone. But the road's narrow width meant the front vehicles had nowhere good to go, and the column bunched up instead, exposed along nearly 200 meters of open road beneath the rock face. Reyes and Tran scrambled to find the source of the fire, scopes sweeping the ridgeline above. But the angle from their position put them at a disadvantage. The gunman, whoever he was, had chosen his position with real skill, tucked into a shadowed crevice that broke up his outline and made him almost impossible to distinguish from the rock around him. "I don't have eyes on him," Reyes called over the radio, voice tight. "Muzzle flash is washing out against the rock. I can't get a clean read on his position." A third burst hit the third vehicle in the column, this one finding a gap in the armor near the door seam, and a soldier's voice came over the net reporting a man down, not dead, but bleeding badly, pinned in the open by fire that showed no sign of stopping. In the supply truck near the rear, Mara had already moved. The moment the first shots hit, she'd grabbed her rifle case and dropped out the back of the vehicle, using the truck's bulk as cover while she assessed the terrain with the same flat, unhurried attention she'd given every range session since arriving at Ardent. Except now there was nothing performative about the calm. It was simply how she worked. She watched the muzzle flashes for 2 more bursts, ignoring the chaos closer to the front of the column, ignoring the panicked chatter on the radio, focusing entirely on the pattern of light against shadow 900 meters up the rock face. Most shooters, even good ones, would have struggled to place the shots precisely enough to engage at that range under that lighting, with that much foliage breaking up the sight line. But Mara wasn't looking for the shooter the way Reyes and Tran were. She was looking for the absence of something, a patch of darkness that didn't shift the way the rock around it shifted, a stillness inside the chaos that meant a person holding position, not random shadow. She found it on the 4th burst. Without announcing herself over the radio, without asking for confirmation from Whitlock, who was still scrambling forward to find a usable position himself, Mara settled into a kneeling brace against the truck's rear wheel well, built a rest from her pack, and ranged the target through her scope in seconds, dialing elevation and windage with hands that didn't hesitate, the same hands Dawson had noticed weeks earlier, perfectly steady in the middle of a chaos that had every other soldier's pulse hammering. 940 meters. A crosswind gusting unevenly through the pass, the kind of wind that made distance shots a gamble even for very good shooters. A target exposed for perhaps half a second between bursts, partially obscured by rock and shadow, firing down at a column that had no clean way to return effective fire. She didn't think about the section's jokes, or Whitlock's roster, or the weeks of carrying gear while other people took the positions she could have filled. None of that existed in the narrow, focused space she occupied in that moment. There was only the wind, the range, the half-second window, and the steady, practiced quiet of a mind that had done this before, somewhere far from this convoy, somewhere nobody at Ardent had any idea about. She fired once. The shot crossed the pass in just under a second, and from the rear of the column, it was impossible for most soldiers to even register what had happened until the fire from the ridge simply stopped. No second shooter, no shift in position, just an abrupt and total silence from the high ground that took several seconds to register against the continued chaos closer to the vehicles. "Cease fire from the ridge," Reyes called over the radio. Uncertain, scanning. "Repeat, I'm not seeing return fire from the high ground position." It was Bauer, moving up from the command truck, who reached Mara's position first and found her already breaking down her rest, scanning the ridge a second time through her scope to confirm what she already knew with a kind of certainty that didn't need confirming. "Status?" he asked, breathless from the run, taking in the picture in front of him. The supply truck, the makeshift rest, the rifle still settled in her shoulder. "Target's down," Mara said simply. "Single shooter, elevated position, roughly 950 out. He won't be engaging again." Bauer looked from her face to the ridgeline and back, and something in his expression shifted, the pieces of the last 2 weeks rearranging themselves rapidly into a shape that finally made sense. Behind them, the convoy was already reorganizing, medics moving toward the wounded soldier in the third vehicle, the column's commander shouting instructions to get the vehicles moving again before any secondary attack developed. Nobody else had yet realized that the fire from the ridge had stopped because of a single shot taken from the rear of the formation, from a position nobody had thought worth defending, by a soldier nobody had bothered to ask onto the front line. Whitlock arrived a moment later, having scrambled back from his own position once the ridge went quiet, and stopped short when he saw Mara calmly checking her rifle's chamber, Bauer standing beside her with an expression Whitlock had never seen on the senior NCO's face before. "What happened?" Whitlock said, not quite a question. "She happened," Bauer said quietly, nodding toward the ridge. "From back here. 950 meters, moving wind, half a second of exposure." He looked at Whitlock, something hard entering his voice for the first time in the conversation, while she was riding security with the supply trucks. Whitlock said nothing. He looked at Mara, who was already reloading her magazine with the same unhurried calm she'd shown on the range 2 weeks earlier, and for the first time since she'd arrived at FOB Ardent, he found himself without a single dismissive thing to say. The convoy limped the rest of the way through the pass and into the secure layup point 20 minutes later. Vehicles dented, and one soldier loaded onto a medevac bird with a wound that would heal clean, thanks to a fast tourniquet, and a medic who hadn't panicked. By the time the column rolled back through the gate at FOB Ardent that afternoon, word of what had happened on the ridge had already outrun the vehicles themselves. It wasn't Mara who told the story. She hadn't said more than a dozen words since the shot, debriefing the incident with flat, professional brevity to the convoy commander, and then retreating to clean her rifle in the same quiet corner of the equipment tent she always used. It was Bauer who told it, and Dawson, and eventually half a dozen soldiers from the convoy itself, each version adding a little more detail until the story had taken on the shape of something almost unbelievable. A shot nobody else could have made, taken from a position nobody had thought to defend, by the one soldier the section had spent 2 weeks treating like a liability. Lieutenant Colonel Voss heard about it before the convoy had even finished unloading. She'd been at the operations center when the contact report came through that morning, had read the after-action summary twice, and had a very specific question for her staff by early afternoon. Who was Specialist Mara Kessler, and why didn't anyone seem to actually know? What Voss found, once she made a few calls outside normal channels and leaned on a contact at Personnel Command who owed her a favor, took most of the afternoon to surface and explained, finally, everything the redacted file had been hiding. Mara Kessler hadn't come from administrative support at Bagram. She'd spent 4 years as a sniper attached to a special operations task force, 2 combat tours that had earned her a commendation nobody outside a very small circle was cleared to read about, and a reputation, in the units that had worked with her, as one of the most reliable long-distance shooters they'd ever fielded. She'd also lost her spotter 18 months earlier, in circumstances the file summarized in a single clinical line that gave no real sense of what it must have cost her, and had requested, afterward, a transfer to something quieter. Logistics support, a slower pace, a chance to step back from the work that had taken so much from her without anyone watching too closely or asking too many questions. Battalion had granted the request, reassigned her instead to a standard sniper section when a slot opened that fit her qualifications on paper, and nobody along the way had thought to flag any of it for the soldiers she'd actually be working alongside. The redactions weren't a mystery or a warning. They were simply privacy, protecting details that weren't anyone's business unless the Army decided otherwise, which, after that morning in the mountain pass, it apparently had. Voss called a formation that evening. The entire section assembled outside the command tent in the long orange light before sunset. She didn't raise her voice. She rarely needed to. This morning, this convoy element took contact in the pass and sustained one casualty before an enemy position on elevated terrain was neutralized with a single shot at just under 1,000 meters, under crosswind conditions, from a soldier riding rear security with the supply trucks. She let that sentence sit in the air for a moment, looking slowly across the assembled section. I want to be very clear about something. Specialist Kessler did not get lucky this morning. She has 4 years of experience that most of you don't have access to knowing about, 2 deployments most of you will never hear the details of, and a record that earned her the right to be treated like a professional the moment she walked onto this base, a record this section apparently decided wasn't worth checking. Whitlock stood rigid near the front of the formation, eyes fixed somewhere past the colonel's shoulder, his face carefully blank in the particular way of a man absorbing something he knew he deserved. I'm not interested in assigning blame for assumptions made before today, Voss continued. I am interested in making sure this section understands, going forward, that quiet does not mean inexperienced, and that a thin personnel file is not the same thing as an empty one. She paused. Specialist Kessler will be reassigned to lead designated marksman positioning for this section's missions going forward, effective immediately. Staff Sergeant Whitlock, you'll coordinate that transition personally. Yes, ma'am, Whitlock said, the words coming out tighter than he probably intended. Voss dismissed the formation a moment later, and the section broke apart slowly, soldiers drifting back toward their tents in a quiet that felt different from the silence that had followed Mara around for 2 weeks. Less suspicious, more uncertain of how to behave now that the uncertainty itself had been resolved. Reyes approached her first, hands in his pockets, looking for a moment like he was searching for the right thing to say and not quite finding it. That shot today, he said finally. I couldn't have made that. Not in that wind, not at that range. Conditions were workable, Mara said. You'd have found it eventually. It wasn't quite forgiveness, and it wasn't quite an excuse for him either. Just an honest assessment delivered the same flat way she delivered everything else, and Reyes seemed to understand that was as much acknowledgement as he was going to get, and that it was, in its own way, more generous than he'd earned. Whitlock found her later that evening, alone by the equipment tent, breaking down her rifle for cleaning under the glow of a single, hanging light. He stood there a moment before speaking. I should have put you on the line today, he said. Not the supply trucks. You didn't know, Mara said, not looking up from the bolt carrier in her hands. That's not really an excuse. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable in a way that didn't come naturally to him. I made a call based on what I assumed about you instead of what you'd actually shown me. That's on me, not on whatever's in your file. Mara looked up at him then, studying his face for a moment with the same quiet attention she gave everything, and something in her expression eased slightly, just enough to notice. Apology accepted, she said. I'd still like that heavier barrel profile moved up in the supply order, though. Heat's not getting any better out here. A faint, surprised laugh escaped him before he could stop it. I'll put the request in tomorrow. She nodded once and went back to her rifle, And Whitlock walked away into the settling dark, understanding, finally, that the quiet woman who'd arrived 2 weeks earlier carrying one duffel bag and a rifle case she wouldn't let anyone touch had never needed the section's approval at all. She'd simply been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for them to earn the right to give it.